This video is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Switching to Mint Mobile is the easiest way to save in 2024. Wireless plans are $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. To get this new customer offer, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan, and Happy New Year. It's the first show of 2024. We have a lot of ground to cover. We are going to look at the New Year's holiday box office. We're also going to look at the year 2023. Which studio came out on top? What were some of the biggest opening weekends? Just sort of a wrap up of the year that we just had. But before we get to any of that, I actually want to look back really quickly at the Christmas 5-day holiday weekend. On last week's show, I mentioned that the numbers I had were estimates, and most of those final numbers just came in yesterday as people got back from the holiday breaks, especially Warner Brothers. They had estimates up for like over a week. So very quickly, I want to go back to the Christmas 5-day holiday, and then we'll talk about what just happened over New Year's weekend. So these were the 5-day numbers for December 22nd through the 26th. Aquaman was the number one movie over that stretch with $46.4 million, followed by Wonka at just over $37 million. The Color Purple opened to just over $25 million, followed closely by Migration at $24.3 million, and then Anyone But You rounded out the top 5 at $10.65 million. Then we had The Boys in the Boat, which was a Christmas Day opener at $8.7 million in sixth place, followed by The Iron Claw right behind it at $8.5 million. Solar Part 1 Ceasefire ends up at number 8, just under $7 million. Then we had The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes at $5.3 million, and finally Ferrari rounding out the top 10 at $4.4 million. So that was the 5-day Christmas holiday. What did the last box office weekend of the year look like? Well, Wonka reasserted its dominance at number 1 with a 23.2% gain in business from the previous weekend at $22.4 million. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom falls to number 2 with $18.2 million. It lost 34% from its opening weekend and was the only movie in the top 5 to actually lose business versus the weekend before. And that's something that we talked about. The previous weekend to this one, which was December 22nd through the 24th, is usually a fairly low attended weekend at the movies, which means that the next weekend you usually see an uptick in business because people are going to the movies. And that's what we saw with every single movie in the top 5 except for Aquaman. Aquaman is the only one that actually lost business from the week before, and it's something that I've been seeing with Aquaman. People have been saying like, see, it's not doing that badly. I will concede that it is not an absolute disaster, as many other movies have been, and we'll look at its performance in a few minutes. And some people I've seen have even used that drop saying like, well, it only dropped 34%. That's the second best hold in the DCEU history. Well, yeah, that's because the best hold was the first Aquaman movie, and it's because both movies were released over that exact same window over the Christmas holidays. That's why the hold is so strong. But when you look at these other films and the returning films and the fact that they all gained business except for Aquaman, again, I think that kind of leads you to where its picture is going domestically, and we'll look at grosses all around the world very shortly. In third place was Migration with a 36.6% increase in business at $17 million. Then we had The Color Purple in fourth place. Technically, its quote-unquote opening weekend was this past weekend, the 29th through the 31st, because it opened on Christmas Day. So its opening goes down as $11.7 million, but it's made over $44 million so far. Anyone But You has a 45.9% increase in business at $8.75 million. It's in fifth place with a domestic total just under $25 million. Then we have The Boys in the Boat in sixth place, followed by The Iron Claw and Ferrari. Again, this was technically Ferrari's opening weekend. Its total gross so far is just over $10 million, which isn't great for a movie that reportedly cost around $100 million to make. Then The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, still hanging around the top 10 at $2.87 million. Its domestic gross is now over $150 million. And The Boy and the Heron rounds out the top 10 at $2.3 million. Its domestic tally now over $35 million. And then when we look at the 4-day weekend, which is inclusive of New Year's Day, Wonka's at number 1 with $29.1 million, followed by Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom at $23.5 million, and Migration at $22.1 million, so fairly competitive there for numbers 1 through 3. The Color Purple's at $14.3 million, followed by Anyone But You. Then The Boys in the Boat, The Iron Claw, Ferrari, The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and The Boy and the Heron. So the exact same lineup for the New Year's 4-day weekend as the 3-day weekend, but still good to note for what the holiday weekend is. And when we look at movies that dropped out of the top 10, Godzilla Minus One, and it was just barely. It almost took that number 10 spot away from The Boy and the Heron. Drops out after 4 weeks, but it is still a phenomenally successful domestic run for that film. It's showing up on a lot of critics' top 10 lists as well, including mine. Solar Part 1, Ceasefire, and Donkey, 2 films from India, also drop out of the top 10 after 1 week. And when we look at the movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes lost 849 theaters. It remains in 1,660. Godzilla Minus One lost 785 theaters. It remains in 1,180. The Boy and the Heron lost 640. It has technically fallen out of wide release. It's now in 940 theaters. Wish was dropped by 475 theaters. It's now in 1,265. And then Napoleon also dropping out of wide release. It lost 252 theaters and is still playing in 750. This is what I call the road to recovery, and it is the final chart for this year. That blue line you see are the weekend averages for 2015 through 2019, the 5 years leading into the pandemic. The red line would be the weekend averages for 2021 and 2022, and then that dotted black line are the weekend totals for this year, and you can see that we end in that week 52 line there, not even where we have been on average for the end of the year for 2021 and 2022. Luckily, it's been a bit of an uptick, but you can see we're also not even close to where we were before the pandemic shut theaters down. The top performing films in years past were The Force Awakens for that 2015 through 2019 window as it continued its box office run, and Spider-Man No Way Home for 2021 and 2022 as it continued its box office run. And I've been keeping this chart as a sort of record to see how the box office bounces back once theaters reopened as the pandemic died down, and part of that is rolling all of these averages as we get to the end of each year into that overall average. So the red line was the weekend totals for 2021 and 2022. We're now going to average in the weekend totals for 2023. So let's look at that chart again. We will now get rid of the dotted black line for 2023, and now when we average in the weekend totals for this past year, we can see that impact on the red line. As you can see, what we basically did was close the gap a little bit at the beginning of the year. So overall box office increased, although you can still see well below where we were pre-pandemic. Look at the red peak there right around week 23. Somewhere in the middle of the summer, we're actually catching up to where we were before theaters shut down back in 2020. But that's where things get a little bit dire, because when you look at the red line there, the rest of summer is sort of catching up. You can thank Barbenheimer and all of that stuff for helping out with those numbers. But look at the fall. We're actually regressing from where we were as far as catching up to the pre-pandemic levels. And that's largely because when you look at that big spike around week 45 before we added in those 2023 totals, that's where Wakanda Forever came out back in 2022. And you can see when we average in this very lackluster fall box office, we are losing pace with where we were pre-pandemic when we bring in what happened in 2023. There's a bit of an uptick. We're above the pace pre-pandemic in a couple of weeks, but we are losing pace in a lot of other areas. And so what I think is very interesting here is this look at the back half of the year, and you can see the impact of the writers and actors strikes, because you see the fact that we are losing ground now in the fall when we should be gaining ground, and we'll see what happens in this upcoming year. A lot of big high-profile projects were pushed out of 2024 and into 2025, and some people are projecting that the box office overall may actually even be lower this year than it was back in 2023. So we will see. I will continue to track this road to recovery and see how we do now against a 3-year average. But what we've seen so far is a very slowly recovering theatrical window through the first 5 to 6 months of the year, as well as difficulty regaining some traction in the autumn months. Maybe we can start to reverse that trend here in 2024. Looking at the top 5 films internationally, so these are all markets outside of the United States and Canada. At number 1 is Shining for One Thing, which is a film out of China about a woman mystically transported back to her high school years. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom comes in second place with $50.5 million, followed by Wonka at $39.1 million. The Chinese film Johnny Keep Walking is in fourth place. It's a workplace comedy, followed by I Did It My Way, which is a new Hong Kong action film starring Andy Lau. When we take those international numbers, we combine with our domestic numbers, we get the top 5 films worldwide over the past weekend. And Shining for One Thing remains number 1 at $77.1 million. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom lost 36.4% worldwide from the previous weekend, but it's in second place at $68.7 million. Wonka, though, close behind. It gained 21% business from the previous weekend worldwide at $61.57 million, followed by Migration, which jumped 68.6% from the previous weekend for a $34.1 million worldwide finish, and then Johnny Keep Walking in fifth place at $25.8 million. So let's talk about some of these films that are in the top 5, and I mentioned Wonka, which has kind of become the movie of the holidays. It lost that number 1 spot when Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom was released. It began regaining that ground starting really the day after Christmas, and I think if you were going to name the movie for the holiday season, then it would probably be Wonka at number 1, even though there has been a lot of business spread around, and it is also creeping ever so slowly towards profitability in the theatrical window, which is very elusive these days, and which, as I've mentioned before, is really the goal for a lot of studios. If you can break even in that theatrical window, then all of that other money, marketing, merchandise, digital sales, anything else, licensing, whatever you want to do, that all comes back to you as profit. And when we look at Wonka's potential profits, keeping in mind this is only global box office receipts, this does not include ancillaries or other income. Wonka was made for a budget of around reportedly $125 million. You tack another $100 million in advertising costs. That gets you to a cost of $225 million for the film. It's made almost $250 million internationally, about $100 million-ish between all markets. Of that has come back to the studio. About $34.5 million came back from the first week domestically. Because it had such a strong performance in the second week, we had another $29.2 million come back, and then another $14.5 million come in the third week of release so far. This is why a strong, robust, long-legged domestic performance is great, because much more of that money comes back to the studio. So we have right now a worldwide gross nearing $400 million. I estimate a net of 177.4 of that has come back to the studios and investors thus far. You balance that against the $225 million in reported costs, and Wonka is less than $50 million from breaking even in the theatrical window. I think it's very likely that that is actually going to happen, and that means it's a hit. I mean, really, without reservation, you can say that it's a hit, because it means it's going to be a very profitable movie for the studio when all other ancillary revenues come in. I could very well see the studio deciding to greenlight a Wonka sequel, perhaps lining up a little bit more on the version of Willy Wonka that we already know, which I think means that they could cash in even more on the nostalgia. Do they try to restage the first movie or set up some kind of a prequel to that? Who knows? But Wonka, I think, is the one movie that you can look at this holiday season and say this was absolutely a success. As I mentioned, a lot of folks have been making the case for Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, and as I also said earlier, I think the best thing that you can say about it is that it's not a complete disaster in the manner of films like The Marvels or The Flash or Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. It's merely a fairly large disaster or a massive disappointment, whatever you might want to call it. Let's look first of all at how it's doing compared to the box office run of the first movie. And you can see that it didn't start off close to the first Aquaman, and that gulf has only widened through 11 days of release. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom right now is at about $81.7 million domestically. The first Aquaman movie was about to break $200 million domestically at the same point in its release. So there really is no comparison between the first Aquaman movie and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. I know people looked at that second weekend drop and said, see, it's like the first Aquaman. It is nothing like the first Aquaman. It's not doing nearly as well as the first Aquaman movie did. Now, it does compare favorably to The Marvels. The Marvels is there in blue. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is there in orange. And you can see that The Marvels actually started out tracking ahead of Aquaman, but starting on around day 6, really once the holiday season kicked in, Aquaman pulled ahead, and it is now outgrossing the Marvels by about $15 million. It should end up fairly significantly ahead of the film domestically, which is why I say you can't call it a complete disaster, because mathematically it's doing better than other complete disasters that came out this year. I think it is partially helped in that regard by the holiday season and the increased movie going that you see. I think it may be also helped by perhaps generally a bit of a better audience reaction, although the cinema scores were roughly the same. But I think the holiday season really is what you're going to look at here, and Aquaman benefited from that. If the Marvels had released during the same holiday window, would it have done better? Maybe. I don't think it could have done much worse, but I also don't think that there would have really been room for two big high-profile superhero films in the marketplace at the same time this particular holiday season. Let's look at Aquaman's profitability situation, and again, this is based off of a reported budget of $205 million, a slashed advertising budget of $100 million, and some people have said, well, wait a minute, you're saying that Aquaman is way too expensive because they cut the advertising budget. Giving this movie an advertising budget of $100 million is a reduction in advertising based on what you would normally get for a $200 million superhero and comic book film. And this is also based on reported estimates in various media sources. So I'm giving Aquaman a cost of around $305 million. It's brought in about $10.3 million from China so far, about $56.6 million from its international grosses so far, $34.9 million from the first week domestically, $12.9 million from the second week domestically. Again, the importance of a robust domestic performance. So I have the gross currently at $269.1 million worldwide, netting $114.8 out of that $269 million. Up against a cost of $305 million, I have Aquaman still needing $190.1 million to become profitable, which is why I say it is not a complete disaster in the sense that it's not going to lose over $200 million from the studios, but I think it is going to lose well over $100 million for the studio, and that's still not great. I think that's sort of the sliding scale that this year's put us on. If a movie's not an absolute disaster, people say, well, you're giving it too hard of a time. It's a hit. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is not a hit. It is going to lose a large amount of money. It's just not going to lose the same massive amount of money as other bigger flops have lost this year. Finally, with Aquaman, let's look at where it stands currently in the DCEU. It has done better than Shazam! Fury of the Gods and Blue Beetle, so it's got that going for it as far as 2023 goes. It's also outgrossed the Suicide Squad and Wonder Woman 1984. It will soon pass Birds of Prey and The Fantabulous, etc. And then we'll see if it can pass The Flash. Can it become the highest grossing domestic film of 2023 for the DCEU? That would certainly be a symbolic win, although not much of a consequential win, but I think that the odds are pretty good that it might be able to do that. And then looking at the film as far as worldwide gross, it has already moved past The Flash. It's now 9th all-time in the DCEU, so it is the highest grossing film of the DCEU this year, bypassing The Flash, Shazam, and Blue Beetle. It's got about another $100 million to go if it wants to pass the first Shazam as well as Black Adam. It's about, $125 million away from doing that. Of course, it's not going to sniff 2017's Justice League, which is at $655.9 million. And really, the key here is going to be these next few weeks. We have not seen Aquaman sustaining or picking up business. The holiday season and going into January is always a bit of a long game. We'll see what Aquaman 2's long game is. I also want to talk a little bit about Migration, because that's another movie that picked up business on the second week that some people have said, well, wait a minute. Actually, it's not doing as badly as we thought it was, which I guess that's technically true, but by Illumination standards, it still has a very long way to go. When we look at the highest grossing films for Illumination, right now Migration is at $59.1 million. It still has about another $50 million to go if it wants to just not be the lowest grossing Illumination film of all time, and another $100 million to go just to get up to The Secret Life of Pets 2. Now, this was a bit of a lower budgeted film, between $70 to $80 million reportedly. That will work in its favor, but still, it's got a long way to go before we could start calling Migration a hit. When we look at Illumination worldwide, Migration has now just passed the $100 million mark worldwide. It is now about $80 million behind 2011's Hop. But again, look at that gulf after that. It's got another, $250 million if it wants to pass the Lorax, unless we have another Puss in Boots situation here where a movie just does crazy business all throughout January. Then I don't think we're going to see it even approach that. And once again, it could be on this Aquaman sliding scale of, well, it wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be. Okay, that's fine. But you can't really call it a hit at this point either. One more movie I want to talk about that's in the top 5 at the box office, and that's The Color Purple. On last week's show, I noted that it had one of the best Christmas Day openings of all time, even better than Les Miserables, which is another musical adaptation for the big screen. But since then, it has not quite been able to keep pace with Les Mis or many other Christmas Day releases. So let's look at Les Miserables versus The Color Purple. And as you can see, they both started out basically identically with identical openings on day one, of course, if you don't adjust for inflation. But look at that divergence. It's sort of like Aquaman and Aquaman 2. The Color Purple's really flattened out through 8 days. Les Mis was at about $80 million. The Color Purple is just under $50 million. So what we really saw was a movie that could open exceptionally well. They really were able, with Warner Brothers and the marketing, etc., to turn out an audience on opening day. The issue has been keeping that momentum. It's lost a lot of momentum in its first week of release. The Oscar nominations could perhaps help its cause. It's reportedly around a $100 million movie, so it's not one of those lower budget threshold films. It actually does need to do pretty well in the theatrical window domestically to improve its financial situation, and that doesn't reflect on the critical situation or anything like that. But this is a really interesting case study in being able to get people out on opening day, but not quite as much through the days afterward. 2 different movies in the same basic genre, the live-action adaptation of a stage musical that had very differing fortunes so far. So that's a look at some of the films currently topping the box office. Before we wrap out the weekend and take a look at 2023 overall, I want to introduce a new feature to the show. I'm happy to say that this is the beginning of an official partnership with Mint Mobile and the Mint Mobile hotline here on the show. So you'll see it here every week on Charts with Dan. You'll also see it every week on a new news show that I'm starting right here on the channel. There's basically a number that you can call. It's +1 323 863 3311. That +1 is there for international callers. You can call that number, leave me a voicemail, and I may pick your question to be answered here on the show. And of course, I want to thank Mint Mobile for providing the Mint Mobile hotline. And I want to start with a couple of questions this week, some very interesting questions. Our first one is from Caleb in Atlanta.
Hey, Dan, this is Caleb L. from Atlanta, Georgia, and I had a question. Recently, I became an AMC Stubs A-List member. How do those subscriptions apply to box office totals? Because I probably see at least 1 movie a week, usually 2. Great show. Love the work. Keep it up. Thanks.
Caleb, thanks so much for asking that question. It's actually one of the most often asked questions I've seen, not just here on this show and on this channel, but on other channels since things like A-List have come out in the last, 4 or 5 years. And I've looked into this several times and the answer remains the same. Basically, as far as the studio goes, nothing changes with AMC A-List. There is no difference in what they see, unless AMC perhaps may have negotiated with them a bit of a lower rate, but there's no actual tangential reports saying that the studio sees any different cut from an AMC A-List purchase versus somebody just walking up to the ticket counter and buying a ticket. They get the same amount of money either way. The difference is on AMC's end. And the way that that makes money for AMC is a couple of different ways. Number one, if you pay $15, $20 a month, whatever it is regionally for you, for AMC A-List, and you only go see 1 movie a month, well, AMC's paying out to the studio $7, $8, $9 a ticket, depending on how much they have to pay the studio. And they're pocketing the rest of that, $11, because you only went to see 1 movie that month. But let's say you are a regular AMC A-List member, like you, Caleb. You go see 1 or 2 movies a week. Well, technically, AMC might be losing money on that A-List membership. At $7 a movie, they're paying, $56 a month out to different studios because that's the cut of the ticket prices. But they are relying on you going to the concession stand, because if you're part of that A-list, that means that you are pretty much exclusively going to AMC theaters, and they're saying like, okay, well, you know what, if we can get you in the door, if you're a frequent user, maybe we lose money on you as far as paying ticket prices out to studios, but we're hoping that you go to the concession stand. We're hoping that you buy popcorn, you buy drinks, you buy those huge profit margin items. That's what really generates a lot of profit for the movie theaters, not so much the ticket sales. So that's really kind of the model. People say like, well, wait, if I go to use A-list, does that mean that the ticket counts differently or that less money goes to the studio? There's no proof of that. Nobody's really ever made that case. It really doesn't make a difference to the studio how you buy your ticket. It's really all about the theater chain and how they make their money off of you. A lot of it is people that just don't use their membership as much as they could. And a lot of it is people that go and buy a drink or popcorn every time. That's how they make their money back. Hey, because it's week 1, why don't we hit up this Mint Mobile hotline again and get another question? And this one comes from Cole.
Hey, Dan. My name is Cole, longtime listener, first-time caller. There's a great interview with Matt Damon where he talks about how mid-budget movies used to make money, where they would have kind of a ripple effect. They would come out in theaters, people buy tickets. They would come out on home video, people would buy tapes or DVDs, and then they would come out on cable, and they would get syndication money. So even like your mid-level movie made money downstream. But how would coming out on streaming, direct-to-streaming movies or things that were theatrical then instantly went to streaming, how do they expect these to be profitable? That's it. Thanks.
Thanks for that question, Cole. And listen, if I had the answer to that question, I would be a rich man because every studio and streamer would be knocking on my door to try to get what the answer was. And that is the question that they've all been trying to ask, because Matt Damon and you are both correct. The way that the old system used to work is you would put out a movie. Once that movie was through the theatrical window, you would sell it into like a pay one window, meaning the first place you could see it, usually an HBO or a Showtime or even a Netflix once they started licensing movies. And then you could sell it to cable. You could license it out to TNT or TBS. Then on top of that, you would have physical media sales, Blu-rays, 4Ks, DVDs, VHS tapes back in the day, and digital purchases also with the iTunes store and everything else. And what streaming has done is come in and destabilize that entire thing. First of all, we've seen a decline in the theatrical window. A lot of that is due to the pandemic, but a lot of that is also due to people saying, hey, I'm not going to go see it in a theater. I'm just going to stay at home and wait to watch it on streaming. That's also deflated the cost as far as those pay one windows, because you can't necessarily license a movie to HBO or Showtime or Netflix or whatever, because it's now on your own streaming service if you're Disney or if you're Warner Brothers, pretty much any studio except for Sony. So you don't get that revenue either. Digital sales and physical media sales have also fallen because, again, these movies just live on the streaming services forever. So there's not that scarcity. There's not that idea of like, well, I want to watch Oppenheimer whenever I want to. I'm going to buy the 4K or whatever. If it's always on a streamer, then people aren't buying physical media anymore. And so, yes, we have seen a collapse of so many of those revenue streams due to streaming. And the idea that all these studios had simultaneously was that all of that revenue would be made up with streaming revenue, that they would all have wildly successful streaming services, and that the subscriber revenue would surpass all of the other revenue sources that they were giving up. And what we've seen, the sort of crisis that the studios have been in, is that, first of all, it's an incredibly competitive space. Secondly, they can't make as much money on these streaming services as they wanted to, because number one, the subscribers aren't growing at the rates that they wanted them to, but also because the companies had to invest billions of dollars to get these streaming services up and running and to stay competitive with the other streamers. Many of them have not yet turned a profit. Many of them are just now turning a profit, but still have to make back billions or tens of billions of dollars in investment. And at the same time, some of the more traditional revenue streams that a lot of these studios were reliant on, things like cable television and advertising, stuff like that, Disney with ESPN, Paramount with their over-the-air networks, those are also collapsing. And so these studios are now all of a sudden in a revenue crunch. They're losing money, and they've largely dismantled the system that was in place for decades that brought a lot of money reliably into the studios. And that's why all of them are so desperate right now to figure out a fix and figure out what's going on. So usually I want to have an answer to the questions here on the Mint Mobile hotline, but to your question, Cole, I have to say I don't know the answer. And if you know the answer, don't tell anybody and sell it to the highest bidder, because you're going to be a very rich man. You could buy and sell this channel. That is the $10 billion question that every studio in Hollywood wants to figure out. Well, that was a lot of fun, and the Mint Mobile hotline will be a fixture right here on the channel for many, many months to come. Thank you so much to Mint Mobile for partnering with me and for allowing me to answer the questions here on the show every week. And also, thanks to Mint Mobile for sponsoring this video. It's the new year, and did you know that on average it takes about 30 days for a person to break their New Year's resolution? Well, it's time to break that cycle, because if saving money is one of your resolutions, get started right now with a quick and easy switch to Mint Mobile. For a limited time, wireless plans from Mint are $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan that's unlimited talk, text, and data for $15 a month. So take your current bill and think about how much more it is every month than $15. All of those savings every single month could be yours, which will go a long way towards paying for that gym membership that you're definitely going to use this year. At Mint, all plans come with unlimited talk and text, plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. And you can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring over your phone number along with all of your existing contacts. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Okay, let's wrap out these weekend numbers so that we can get to the 2023 year in review. First of all, these are the per theater averages for the past weekend, December 29th through the 31st. All of Us Strangers remains the number one draw on a per theater basis, bringing in $18,934 in 6 theaters, followed by The Zone of Interest, bringing in $16,106, also in 6 theaters. Memory remains in 2 theaters, bringing in $12,241 per theater, followed by American Fiction, which is in 40 theaters nationwide at $10,265. We should probably see an expansion as more awards nominations start coming out. And then Wonka, the only wide release sneaking into this list, $5,549 per theater in each of its 4,051 theaters. Looking at the top films in limited release for December 29th through the 31st, we have Poor Things, which brought in $2.2 million in 800 theaters, followed by Donkey in 478 theaters, bringing in just over $1 million. Salar Part 1 Ceasefire brought in just under $700,000 in 540 theaters. Then we have American Fiction at $410,000 in 40 theaters, and All of Us Strangers in just 6 theaters, bringing in $113,605. And when we look at the top grossers in limited release for 2023, this list is now closed because it starts on January 1st and it ends on December 31st. Pathaan ends the year as the top grosser in limited release at $17.4 million, followed by Javan at $15.19 million and Animal at $13.6 million. So 3 films from India in the 1, 2, 3 spot. Past Lives is in 4th place, just ahead of Poor Things, which ends up in the top 5. And actually, if this had extended beyond December 31st, it would have passed the gross of Past Lives at number 4, but the clock restarts on January 1st. Radical ends up in 6th place. Salar Part 1 Ceasefire ends up in 7th place at $8.26 million, followed by The Return of the Jedi re-release. Donkey ends up in 9th place at $7.16 million, and then A Man Called Otto ends up in 10th. So 5 of the 10 movies this year in limited release, the top 10 grossers, were from India. We've seen a very big performance from Indian films in limited release this year. Looking at the 2023 fall holiday box office, this does not end on December 31st, so we will keep updating this chart. This is all movies released from after Labor Day to the end of the year. The Eras Tour for now is at number 1, followed by The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, but Wonka is moving up the list rapidly. If it can bank another $40 million domestically, that it will be the number 1 movie of the fall holiday box office season. Five Nights at Freddy's drops down 1 spot to number 4, followed by Trolls Band Together, which is getting very close close to that $100 million barrier. The Nun 2 is at number 6, followed by the Marvels. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, though, very close to beating the Marvels' domestic gross. It's at $81.7 million versus the Marvels' $84.4 million. Killers of the Flower Moon drops down 1 spot to number 9. The Exorcist Believer drops down 1 spot to number 10. And Paw Patrol the Mighty Movie drops off the list altogether. So let's take a quick look back at 2023 now that the year is in our rearview mirror, and we will look first of all at the overall studio market share, and this was a neck and neck race. When we look at all domestic ticket sales from January 1st to December 31st, Universal is the number 1 studio by a hair, 21.7% to 21.25% over Disney. Universal, it should be noted, had the most releases, wide releases of the year across all divisions, 20 according to the numbers, to Disney's 9, although Disney's budgets were much higher overall. And Universal was boosted by several things. First of all, the phenomenal success of Super Mario Bros. And Oppenheimer, 2 of the top 5 films this year. You had Five Nights at Freddy's, which had that massive opening. And then you had, and a lot of people forget this, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, because remember this revenue starts being counted on January 1st. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish had a phenomenal January run at the beginning of this year, and it was enough to boost Universal to that number 1 spot. Disney, as I mentioned, was in second place at 21.25%, despite having the spillover from Avatar: The Way of Water, which was the 7th highest grossing film of the calendar year. And when you look at the list of what Disney had this year, 3 MCU films, an Indiana Jones film, a Pixar film, an original Disney animated film, a movie based off of one of their biggest theme park attractions, a live action remake, the spillover from Avatar. The fact that they still weren't able to sell the most tickets is pretty astounding because, again, yes, it's fewer movies than Universal released, but those are all home run swings, and they hit a lot of singles and a lot of doubles and not a lot of home runs this year. So it is surprising for me, and I think for most people, when you look at Disney's lineup, that it was not able to be the top grossing studio domestically in 2023. Warner Brothers was third with 15.89% market share. Barbie and Wonka accounted for half of WB's domestic box office. They would have been sunk without those movies, particularly without Barbie. Sony was in fourth place at 11.13%. They only had 1 film in the top 25 this year, which was Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. They went mainly for mid-budget movies, none of which really broke out, but many of which were successful for their size. Paramount just had a bad year, 9.46% market share, 5th place among the 5 major studios. Mission Impossible didn't hit. They made Transformers and Ninja Turtles films that were better regarded from some of the previous ones, but weren't a huge hit. Dungeons & Dragons was a crowd favorite, but a flop. Their Scream franchise just imploded. Of all the studios right now, Paramount is having the worst time, which is probably why there is a lot of talk about mergers and acquisitions. Is Warner Brothers going to buy them? Is Skydance going to buy them? I think it is very likely in 2024 that we could see Paramount acquired by someone. I don't know who, but they do very much seem to be on the auction block. Lionsgate had a 6.6% share after a few impressive releases, including John Wick Chapter 4 and the latest Hunger Games film. Amazon's group of studios accounted for just 2.77% of the overall domestic box office market. And then all other studios made up 11.19% of the total domestic revenue. The official box office tally for 2023, at least according to the sources I've found, is about $8.9 billion. And you may have seen some stories saying that the box office for 2023 exceeded $9 billion. That's technically true if you count the revenue of all 2023 releases going into 2024. So basically, when ComScore, who I think initially reported that, says that the box office gross for 2023 is going to exceed $9 billion, they mean when you count the revenue for movies like Wonka past the beginning of the year, sort of retroactively to 2023 as all 2023 box office releases. But as far as revenue for the calendar year, January 1st through December 31st, it looks like it ends up around $8.9 billion. And when we look at how that stacks up against the other movie years since the turn of the century, so since the year 2000, you can see a fairly steady growth of the box office market, peaking really in 2018, which brought in $11.89 billion. 2019 brought in $11.36 billion. And then, of course, we fell off of a cliff in 2020, just $2 billion in box office revenue. That more than doubled in 2021. Then we went up to $7.3 billion in 2022, and then a very modest step up in 2023 to $8.9 billion. But you can see we are still well below where we were at the box office in 2019. And you may wonder why there is so much room at the top of this chart. Well, if you're a fan of the theatrical window or the theatrical model, then you might want to look away because this is going to be pretty painful. Let's look at these numbers when you adjust for inflation, and you can see even more the dire straits of the theatrical business compared to previous years, because when you do adjust for inflation, you can see that the business was doing reliably in the early 2000s over $15 billion. Going into 2019, adjusted for inflation, we were at $13.6 billion. And we're running at just over half of some of the bigger years in the early 21st century, and really only about 2/3 of what we were looking at pre-pandemic. And so this is really more of a stark look at just where we are compared to where we were in the theatrical business. And the question that everybody wants to know is, will we ever hit those heights again of where we were pre-pandemic? As the years go on, it's looking more and more unlikely. However, the theatrical business has been down and out before. There were many, many times when people said that movies were dead, and then a movie or some kind of a technology or an innovation or something came along and revived them. So that's the big question. Is there going to be that thing that sparks the theatrical industry into a revival that gets us back to past heights? Or are we looking at a complete change in the way that entertainment has worked for the last several decades, where theaters have just lost a chunk of revenue that will never come back? Let's take a look at where we ended up as far as the 2023 annual domestic box office. Now, Wonka could very well sneak onto this list, supplanting the Eras Tour. But for now, of course, Barbie is the #1 movie of the year at $636.2 million, followed by the Super Mario Brothers movie at $574.9 million. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse ends the year at #3 domestically, followed by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and Oppenheimer. The Little Mermaid ends at #6, followed by Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. John Wick Chapter 4 ends the year at #8, followed by Sound of Freedom at #9, and Taylor Swift: The Eras Tour at #10, pending Wonka's final domestic gross. Looking internationally, so these are all markets excluding US and Canada, Barbie was the #1 international box office film of the year at over $800 million, but the Super Mario Brothers movie was close behind at $788.3 million. China's Full River Red was in 3rd place. Oppenheimer was in 4th at $629.1 million. The Wandering Earth 2 at just under $600 million was in 5th place. Fast X comes in 6th, followed by No More Bets from China at #7. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 at #8, so a bit of a loss as far as the international appeal for the MCU. China's Lost in the Stars is at #9, and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 comes in 10th place. When you combine those numbers, these were the top 10 films at the worldwide box office, again, as of now. Barbie at #1 with $1.44 billion, followed by the Super Mario Brothers movie at $1.36 billion. Oppenheimer, about $45 million short of that billion-dollar mark at $955.2 million, although it's still going to try to do re-releases as we get into award season. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is in 4th place at $845.5 million, followed by Fast X at $714.5 million. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse ends the year at #6 worldwide, followed by Full River Red, The Wandering Earth 2, The Little Mermaid, and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. A movie, by the way, that I would have said with some confidence would have been a billion-dollar movie this year. You just never know what's going to happen. Let's look at the top opening weekends domestically for 2023, and this hasn't changed since July. Again, just another glimpse at the effect of the post-strike holiday box office. Barbie had the top opening weekend of the year at just over $162 million, followed by the Super Mario Brothers movie, although again, remember that opened on a Wednesday. Had it opened on a Friday, I think it's very likely that film would have had the top opening weekend of the year. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse had the 3rd best opening of 2023 at just over $120 million, followed by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 at $118.4 million, and Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which opened up to over $100 million back in February. Those are the only movies this year, by the way, that opened to over $100 million domestically. Looking at the top 3-day opening weekends worldwide this past year, Barbie had the highest opening film of the year around the world at $356.3 million, followed by the Super Mario Bros. Movie at $319.1 million, just ahead of Fast X at $318.4 million, then Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 at $289.3 million worldwide, and Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania at $227.4 million. Now, there are some things that I'm kind of holding off on, including which movies had the best legs or the best multiples of their opening weekend of the year. And that's because so many of those films tend to be holiday movies. So I don't want to declare some winners and then have to go back in a few weeks and say like, well, no, actually it was Wonka, or actually it was, The Boys in the Boat or whatever. So when I am able to confidently tell you which films had the best legs of 2023, I will. It'll probably be in 2 or 3 weeks once the holiday box office sort of shakes out. Before we go, I want to do, as we always do at the end of the show, a flashback to a weekend in box office history. And we're going to go back this week to the same box office window, December 29th through the 31st, back in the year 1995. And again, this is what studios wish they still had. Toy Story was the #1 movie in its 6th week of release with $19.3 million. It had a total to that point of $150 million, on its way to a domestic total just under $200 million. Jumanji came in 2nd place at $17.7 million for a $57 million total up to that point. It ended at over $100 million domestically, followed by Grumpier Old Men at $14.9 million, Waiting to Exhale at $13.2 million, and then Father of the Bride Part 2 at $12.3 million. That would look good, honestly, by today's standards, but let's take a look at what happens to these numbers when we hit the inflation button. And if you're a Hollywood executive, look away, because this is what the theatrical market looked like back in 1995 in today's dollars. Toy Story at #1 with just under $40 million domestically, a $302 million running domestic total to that point. It ended up at just under $400 million adjusted for inflation. We had Jumanji in its 3rd week of release at $35.7 million. Its final domestic came in at just over $200 million. Grumpier Old Men in week number 2 at just over $30 million. It ended its run at $144 million adjusted for inflation. Waiting to Exhale at $26.7 million in its 2nd week. Its final total was at $134.8 million. And then Father of the Bride Part 2 at $24.9 million in week 4. Its final total was $154.2 million. And that is what the holiday box office used to look like. It seemed like just about every movie went over the equivalent at that time of $100 million. Every movie, it seemed like, was a success, with very few exceptions in the holiday box office window. And yet, here we are now. There is a lot of road to make up. There's a lot of road that honestly might be behind Hollywood. And that's one of the things that I like about this show. I like tracking box office, not just because it's about money, but because it's about history, it's about human behavior, it's about why people see what they see and when and how, and that fascinates me. And I appreciate that it in some way fascinates you, because you've watched this show for 45 minutes or so, and I've just been yelling numbers at you. That's pretty impressive that you are interested in it as well. So thank you so much for watching the show for another year. As we go into 2024, it's going to be a very interesting year to see which movies hit, which movies miss. Do we lose even more ground theatrically? It's a very interesting time to sort of be chronicling this history week by week. And I appreciate you joining me on this journey. I also appreciate Mint Mobile and the Mint Mobile hotline. You will see that every week here on the show. And don't worry, there's things like the Indie Theater Spotlight that I'll be doing as well. I just kind of have to pick and choose week to week which segments I have based on how much box office news there is to talk about. Thanks so much for joining me here on the channel. Be sure to stay tuned right here for even more, including movie news, reviews, box office, and everything else that I do. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.